Hello, everyone, and welcome to my YouTube channel. It is an absolute pleasure to have with me today Dr. Pippa Malmgren. She's one of my favorite people to follow, not only online, but also in terms of the great books that she has written. Feel free to look out for them in the description of this video. She's an economist, an expert in geopolitics, and an analyst, and has been a former advisor of President George W. Bush. It is an absolute pleasure. Pippa, how are you?
Oh, it's great to see you. And it's been great following you on Twitter as well. I suppose that's how we got to know each other. We often in agreement on many things. So it's great to see you.
Absolutely. There are many bad things about Twitter, trolling, etc. But one of the great things about it is to have the opportunity of meeting somebody like you. No, I would like to start, Pippa, with a broad view. Where we are now in the economy, how is the situation in terms of the recovery in the United States, and what are the elements that you would categorize as the key elements of the current economic situation globally?
You know, I think it's such an interesting moment, and it's not really comparable to any point in history. So it's an original moment. And that's important because people love to look backward for examples and reference points. But I don't think many are so comparable. For example, one of the questions is, what shape is the recovery? Is it a V shape or an L shape? And I keep saying it's quantum, which means it'll be many things at once. There won't be a single narrative that defines this. So they're going to be, I think, if we want to pick a historical reference, it might be like the period when we were recovering from World War I and the Spanish flu. But we had two very extreme outcomes at that time. One was some had assets and drank champagne, right? That's the Great Gatsby. And some lost everything and didn't regain it for 2 generations. That's the Grapes of Wrath. And I think this time is very similar. I see extraordinary innovation. People have been building amazing businesses during lockdown, and they are set to take off. We have extraordinary pent-up demand. I mean, I live in London. You can feel that people are just dying to get into a store and buy things. So suddenly we're going to go from such a low level of GDP. Frankly, you just need one person to sneeze and the GDP is going to jump like crazy, right? A couple of sales and boom, the numbers lift in an extraordinary way. At the same time, we have a record amount of money in the system, which we can argue about whether that's been a good thing or a mistake by governments. But the bottom line is it's there and it's looking for a home. It wants to find an investment. And usually when you have a record number of entrepreneurs and record cash, they will find each other. And then that's generally good for the economy too. And then the last thing is this incredible acceleration of the digitization of everything, including what we're doing right now, talking on Zoom. So taken together, I have a very upbeat view at the moment.
That is amazing. That is great. You were just mentioning how on one side you have this incredible surge in innovation, great startups, fantastic opportunities out there. And at the same time, there is this, I just read, for example, on Bloomberg that about 153 million people left the middle class in 2020 because of the crisis. So do you think that a much quicker recovery and a faster element of innovation and productivity growth is likely to recover that lost middle income part of the economy quickly?
There are competing factors, but I think many of those people, yes, will get lifted out of that degraded position just by the recovery happening. But we have a new force at work, which is very controversial and I think very important, and that's the return of inflation.
Yeah.
And we're seeing loads of signs of inflation, even though every central bank tells you you're imagining it. And I made a list actually to say to you during this podcast. I'm looking at it now. Steel's up 145% in a year, lumber 126, soybeans and oil up well over 70, corn 69. Why does it matter? It matters because inflation is a natural outcome of throwing so much money into the system.
Sure.
And it always hits the poor the hardest. So for those who've lost their foothold on the economy and are genuinely poor, this is a serious development and makes it harder to return to where they used to be before. So again, it's a quantum phenomena. It's split. There are two things happening at once. If you own assets, they're all rising in value. If you don't, you're increasingly in jeopardy.
Yeah. And one of the things that I read, a very interesting paper from Dr. Cavallo, is that inflation actually for the poorest segment of society is probably twice, 3 times higher than official inflation as it's being presented by governments. No, so I think that discrepancy between the allegedly still modest level of inflation and the rising prices of non-replicable goods. You've mentioned a few, but also, for example, in emerging economies, you see that fresh food prices are going up double digit. And obviously that is making it more difficult, isn't it? So, I want to come back to the point that you just made about the record amount of money injected into the economy. What do you think has been different in terms of the response this time, particularly in the United States, which looks to be recovering much faster than many other developed economies? What do you think has been different in terms of the monetary and fiscal response in order to address the crisis?
Well, it's not so much been the response is different, it's the magnitude is different. Yeah. And the willingness of the current policymakers to persist with this huge liquidity. I mean, Janet Yellen, as Secretary of the Treasury, her core view is pretty much that we have to wait until every single human being is employed before she'll start to remove the liquidity, which kind of guarantees that we're going to have inflation. And I agree very much with the assessment that it affects different categories of people in very different ways. We love to talk about the economic numbers, but there really isn't a number that touches everyone the same on average, right? Like nobody's touched on average. That's just a numerical concept. Yeah. The reality is that, for example, young people who tend to spend more of their money on education have felt it for a long time because those prices were rising so fast. They're much more sensitive to inflation than, say, somebody in their 50s who's already paid their mortgage off, right? Yeah. So this is the thing, who gets touched? And that's why what you raised is so important, fresh food prices in emerging markets, because that's what can spark a civil unrest. And that's what kicked off the Arab Spring without any doubt. So that's the point of vulnerability in emerging markets for sure.
Certainly. One of the things that I always say is that money creation is never neutral. It disproportionately benefits the indebted and those that have assets relative to the ones that only have wages and monetary money saved in cash. Obviously, that is going to generate important ripple effects, particularly because of the amount of money injected into the economy last year and how quickly. I think it surprised even the most, let's say, the most doubtful about the inflationary pressures. I think the magnitude of the increase in prices in some of those goods and services that we just talked about. You talked about education as well, but healthcare, insurance, some utilities now in the Eurozone. Quite an important factor, which I think ties up very nicely, actually, the Arab Spring risk of rising food prices, etc., to something that seems to have been completely forgotten in the mindset of investors, which is geopolitics, in which you're obviously a leading expert. What do you think has happened to get to a situation in which investors and commentators have all but forgotten about the risks embedded in the political situation globally? And more importantly, how do you see that going? Do you think that there's, what are the biggest concerns in your mind about the current situation?
Yeah, it's like we're having a relief rally,
Yeah,
partly on the departure of the former president of the United States, who appeared to the world to be the greatest source of geopolitical risk, especially because of the way he took on China. But it's strange because the Biden administration have a similarly tough view, maybe even tougher than the Trump team. And
absolutely.
so, yeah, actually, the geopolitical risk of tension between the US and China has risen, not diminished. And also, the playing field of geopolitics is radically changed. It's so much easier to follow it when you think it's about aircraft carriers and tanks and who has more nuclear weapons. But these days, it's not about that. It's about who has the fastest supercomputers and quantum computers, who's got the best computational power, which is the equivalent of the capacity to break the other side's codes. This is the new race in the
Yeah.
geopolitical world. And because it's invisible to most, they kind of don't know how to process that. But I'd say from a military strategic perspective, that rivalry between the US and China, US and Russia is massively intensifying, not diminishing. So the risk that we get surprised by something is actually going up. Now, the good news is markets are so resilient. I mean,
Yeah.
we've taken every bit of bad news you can pretty much get and bounced back. So you have to hit this thing pretty darn hard to knock it over. And I don't anticipate something that severe. So I'm not as worried that geopolitics was going to be such a huge issue for the markets. Frankly, they're staying in their relief rally, and I think they'll be there for a while.
Obviously, I think that that risk was probably embedded in the weighted average cost of capital that investors use to value stocks already in the past. And since it hasn't changed or actually has accelerated, that probably remains there somewhere embedded in valuations, isn't it? One of the interesting things you just mentioned is exactly that, is that how there was this widespread belief that the US administration had become more protectionist and more confrontational relative to China with President Trump. Yet what we're seeing right now is actually an acceleration, probably a more aggressive stance, as we saw in the summit that the United States and China had of that situation. But I think one of the key parts that people tend to forget is the intellectual property risk that is involved in this geopolitical tension between China and the United States. Is not just something about trade. It's a much more important one about intellectual property. I seem to remember a report from the Department of State talking about hundreds of billions of losses in the United States from intellectual property theft. Where do you think that is going to go to? Do you think that there are going to be tougher measures in that perspective with this new administration?
I do, but the game has moved on even from that.
Yeah.
Now the game is data collection on you and me and everybody watching this. And they'll all be like, what are you talking about? And so it used to be the war games were about tanks and aircraft carriers. Now they're about TikTok and Minecraft. Why is it that we're talking about children's games? And the answer is because they are data collection mechanisms. And they're not just collecting your scores in the game, they're collecting your emotional response as you play. They're collecting the ambient discussion that happens in the household. And suddenly you have parties that have deeper knowledge of you and your psyche, your psychometric profile, than you have of yourself.
Yeah.
That is the new kind of race in the geopolitical world, because if you have that information, you can you can negotiate with an individual in a completely different way, in a very empowered way. And you can navigate sales and activities by a population, from disinformation and propaganda all the way to compelling sales to occur if you have that kind of insight. So now there's a bit of a land grab for who's allowed to take that information. And so that's kind of the new point of contention.
This is amazing because things are moving so fast that we seem to be talking constantly about this battle between the United States and China, who will win, who will lose. One thing that I always say to people is we're talking constantly about who wins and who loses between the United States and China. But what I'm seeing is that the European Union has already lost, hasn't even started the battle. It doesn't have technological giants, has completely abandoned the possibility of becoming a contender in this battle. So I don't know, maybe I don't know who will win between China and the United States. I always bet on the United States because I always say never bet against human ingenuity and always bet against state intervention. So that has worked so far very well, in my opinion. But the European Union, what has happened? What has happened in the European Union, in your opinion, that has left it so far behind in terms of the technological battle globally?
It's a super interesting question. Let me start with this wins or loses aspect. And that my books recently have been very much about how you think about things. And one of them is that the world is not binary.
Yeah.
And you can have two winners at the same time.
Yeah.
We have multiple business models for nations that can succeed simultaneously. I see the US and China equally succeeding, but in very different ways. And so, yeah, depends what's your definition of a winner.
Yeah.
You know, for me, the Chinese economy progresses, but with less personal freedoms. To me, that doesn't equal the winning outcome. The US may progress more slowly than China, although that's to be expected because it's fewer population, but it also has tremendous personal freedoms. And frankly, the speed at which you're growing should have some brakes on it, right? There should be some natural, there should be a thought process about why something shouldn't succeed.
Yeah.
Whereas China, it's all about just go, 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 get everything to work, but you know it's not going to. So they end up with this kind of shadow economy that's very dark and underwater, but nobody talks about it. And the numbers don't really reflect that reality. So is it really winning? I would argue no, not really. And in the end, freedom of thought is really the key to innovation. And I worry for China that they have more and more constrained freedom of thought. So that's one thing. Second thing is then the EU, yes, you can measure it in ways that say that it's fallen behind. You could also say they just have a completely different social contract, a different business model.
Yeah.
What I find really interesting is how it continues to work. Like there it is, it's still there. And clearly the public are not totally delighted with how it's working because you have protest movements all over the place in Western Europe. And the places that do work are typically the ones that have defaulted in some way on the debt load, like Greece. The Italians are attempting to do the same. So the other thing is, when we talk about technological innovation, there's such a difference between what's possible and what's actually done.
Yeah.
Or put another way, technology is always both overhyped and underutilized. So we can introduce a ton of super cool technology in the US, but doesn't mean that anybody uses it, right? Like you can have stuff that for 50 years, nobody actually deploys it. In Europe, my sense is they may not be innovating at the cutting edge of technology, but they might be a little faster than we've been in the US. I mean, look at, they were so much faster to introduce touchless payment systems, for example, right?
Sure.
You know, in the US, having a chip and pin in your credit card is still like, oh, wow, that's so cool.
Yeah.
Right? Like you're not signing your signature and you're like, what are we, like 30 years out of date? So this is the thing, the speed at which human beings actually adopt technology is a different thing from how quickly they create it.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that that is actually a very good point, because one of the things that my kids, for example, when they watch a horror movie, an American horror movie, and you find that one of the characters is looking for a signal with the mobile phone because they're going to be killed at some point, they say, "Why are they looking for a signal?" No, because there is no problem in finding a signal, even probably in a remote part of a country in some countries or the leading economies in the European Union. So that's food for thought, actually. Very, very good point. One of the things that I wanted to touch base with you as well is the endless recovery that we're seeing, for example, in the United States. Is we're seeing that last year when we were making estimates about global GDP recovery, there was almost a unanimous view in the in consensus that the Eurozone would actually recover faster, that China was going to depart the crisis very quickly, and there were the estimates for growth for the recovery of the United States remained between 3 to 4%. Now we're moving into the 6% territory, and unemployment is already at 6%. What do you think that first, do you think that those estimates are valid, and obviously do you think that those can actually happen? Second, what do you think that is different in terms of the speed of the recovery? Do you think it's the vaccination rollout, or there's something more behind it?
Yeah, I didn't agree with those estimates at the time at
I
all.
remember that. That's
My
why I wanted
feeling,
to.
my feeling was the US would recover first and fastest because it always does. You
Absolutely.
know, let's just look back at every single time we've had a bump in the road. And why is that? It's partly because it's an incredibly efficient culture for reallocating capital. It's very quick to recognize mistakes and to discard them and to start again. It's a highly forgiving entrepreneurial culture. It's also so massively diverse that it can withstand a lot of failure
Yeah.
and still power ahead, right? And I mean diverse in so many different ways. I think as well, there was a Donald Trump bias, right? So
Yes.
many people just hated the president that they couldn't imagine giving a good score to the economy. And I was always trying to get people to separate their personal feeling about this individual from their objective assessment of the economy. So now that he's out, it's much easier for people to be like, oh yeah, the American economy is going to do okay. But they just couldn't do it while
They
someone they
couldn't.
really disliked was in charge, right? Which I thought was a great buying opportunity for American assets. So for all those reasons, I just think in the end, the US is always the one to watch. Whenever you enter global strife, it
Yeah.
is likely to come out first and fastest and most sustainably. This is another thing. You know, we should stop looking for who's got the steepest recovery trajectory. Much better is to have a low, gentle, you know, because that's sustainable. You know,
Yeah.
this is not sustainable. And this, you know, sharp upward movements are to be a source of concern. They shouldn't be a sign of success. Slow, steady, that's what we're looking for.
Yeah. When you look at sustainability of growth, what do you have any concerns about these massive ongoing stimulus plans, at the new infrastructure plan that the Biden administration is presenting? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, look, I think that all these policymakers are so afraid that they trigger a slowdown.
Yeah.
And so it's like, you know, that children's game called Jenga,
Yeah.
where you have to pull the sticks out, but not have it all fall down. That's how they feel. They're like, I don't want to pull the stick out because it might fall down. But the reality is there's too much money in the system chasing too few high quality assets in every single category. And that's what I think if we want to get into the crypto Bitcoin arena, this is where it gets interesting, because so much of the excess capital is ending up in that world.
Yeah.
And maybe that's not such a terrible thing. The inflation rate would be much worse if it weren't for that sort of exit door that puts it in to the side pocket. However, now the crypto community is beginning to announce that you can use that stuff to buy real things in the real economy.
Yeah.
So it is going to circulate back in. And so, again, inflation becomes something to keep a close eye on, and to think about carefully how we measure it. And I'm convinced the bond market is no longer properly signaling inflation expectations, because the big institutional buyers of bonds, they're not in there because of a view on inflation. They're in there because the regulators are requiring them to hold more cash liquid assets.
Yeah.
So the link between holding bonds and inflation expectations has been completely broken. And so it's a bad indicator of reality.
What indicators would you pay more attention to? Which ones do you think make more sense? Because obviously what I hear every day is this flawed argument about, well, the 10-year bond yield is at 1.7%, therefore we shouldn't worry. And well, it's not a good indicator, as you very, very well just mentioned. But I think that it's important also to look at other indicators, no, and particularly outside of the aggregate indicators that tend to via having averages reduce the real inflationary pressures. Which ones would you recommend?
Yeah, well, and the other thing is, the way the bond market works is not gradual.
Yeah.
So it's not going to gently start to, indicate inflation expectations. Usually you wake up one morning and there's been a big jump.
Yeah.
And then that's extremely painful when that happens. So it's a bad indicator because it's a jagged one. But second of all, as an economist, what really concerns me is human pain. And so are people feeling pain? Do they feel like, I'm working so hard, but I can't afford rent? I think many people coming out of COVID expected that because of the destruction in the economy, the loss of so many businesses, that now they get a good deal on like rent, right?
Yeah.
Business rent or personal rent. Instead, what we're seeing is record purchases. All of the pent-up demand is suddenly in motion, and prices are rising in all different parts of the world. So the expectation that you would get a good deal is being met by, oh my God, my rent is rising. How is that possible at a time when I can't afford this? That human pain translates directly into protests against governments, civil unrest. And that's what, for me, really matters. So I'm listening to the tone of civil society dialogue rather than looking for a particular number. But, as I read off to you, even to go back to my list, hourly wages in the US are up 8%, but no one feels better. No one feels like, oh yeah, I'm doing great now. No, they're still scared. And if you look at the surveys of the public across the industrialized world, except for Japan, everywhere, even in Europe, they're all going, I'm worried about rising prices.
Absolutely.
So I'm more interested in the sentiment of the human experience at this point than some hard number.
I think that is a great point. It's a great point because if you remember, it was very almost to a T easy to tie the slowdown in the Eurozone previous to COVID-19 to the rise in protests against the increase in cost of living in an environment in which the central bank and governments were telling us day by day that there was no risk of inflation and actually that there was a risk of deflation. So it's actually very interesting to look at those, let's say, data points and signals that show as you explain in your books, actually, that show that some of the indicators are not really reflecting what citizens really perceive. And that, for example, is comes to the point in which here in Europe, you hear all the time that there is this massive amount of savings that has been built in the economy, which is actually true, and that will explode in a wave of consumption. But if there's a perception that the pinch that the average citizen feels is harder than what official inflation figures show, then that impact is actually slower. And we saw it, for example, in the third quarter of 2020, in which the recovery actually became weaker than was expected, precisely because citizens did spend, but did not spend as much as some economists or some governments expected. No?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'm going to say something that's going to sound so strange, but I'm a really big believer. If you are in financial markets and you're trying to, make money in financial markets, it's very important to follow the artists.
Yeah.
Because artists are always brilliant at channeling the zeitgeist. They see things before anyone else. I think Ezra Pound and Marshall McLuhan used to call them the early warning system for society, the radar. And so one reason actually that I wore this top, which is, usually like my weekend gear, is because in 2018, the artist designers at the Paris fashion shows started showing military gear, almost like riot gear. And I remember thinking, as an economist, this is super interesting because we have all the conditions for civil unrest and social protests, and now the artists are showing us what to wear to them. All right, and I'm wearing an example of that. So the artists, they captured, they see it coming, right? And within 18 months, we start to have, the Gilets jaunes, the serious social protests across many parts of the world. So today I'm watching the NFT phenomena very carefully, which is in the cryptocurrency world. And it's basically when you take a video of a video or a video of an artwork and you put a blockchain time geolocation stamp on it, and the valuation of these things has gone insane. And everybody's going like, I don't get it. But if you really dissect it, what the artists behind it are telling you is they've found a mechanism that an artist can now be paid every time their artwork is sold in future. So the people buying NFTs are going, but if I buy this, then the artist will make 10% every time this thing is bought and sold. So now I can support an artist for a lifetime by using this mechanism. Now, this is not the way people in the financial markets think. They think it's a bubble asset, it's overvalued, it's a video of a video. I mean, but what the artists and the younger people typically are thinking is this is a new way to support creativity in society. Yeah. And so that's super interesting to me as the changing thought process. Yeah. And that's why I say, actually, art is always worth paying attention to. And let's look at what's happening in art. Again, record prices being achieved. If that's not, that to me, that's again, an inflation signal that we should think about. Very, very true. Very true. I would like to touch that a little bit deeper in that point about blockchain and Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. Blockchain, this unbelievable technology that is likely to change everything, the way that we perceive, and that is already making big changes in the financial system, in the art world, the music world. It's unbelievable what you see in blockchain as well. I think that one of the important things that we have been hearing in the last months is this idea of central banks moving into digital currency, and the idea of governments getting truly scared about Bitcoin and the probable contenders of fiat currencies. What do you think about that? Where's your mind in this process? So I think the next big event is that governments introduce their own cryptocurrency. Sure. And this is a genuine innovation. I'm not talking about digitizing the current monetary system. I'm talking about the creation of an entirely new monetary system that has no inherent underlying value. Yeah. And politicians are going to love this because you can double or have the money supply with a keystroke. And more important, you can allocate rewards and punishments to the voters using it.
Yeah.
So, for example, I could say, well, let's reward those voters that supported me on this issue by putting free digital money in their mobile phone, because that's how the Chinese are doing it with the new DCEP, which is probably the best example of a sovereign crypto. They just suddenly you wake up and you pick up your phone and there's the equivalent of $1,000, all yours. Go ahead and spend it any way you want. Everybody's like, okay, that's just give it away, right? Because it's just made up, right? It's just bits of electronic information. But at the same time, you can deprive people of capital. You can say, let's tax the people who voted against us in that last issue. And far from giving them money, we're going to force them to pay for having had the wrong view. So the social consequences, the political power inherent in the system is something we really need to think through. The other thing is that I view the Chinese DCEP, as it's called, which is this new sovereign crypto. I think of it more as a surveillance system that behaves like money.
Yeah.
And this is the thing, when
that's a great definition.
Right? It's a surveillance system, and it's tracking every single thing that you do. It's capturing information about you while you transact, like what was your emotional state. All this becomes retrievable because you're giving it away every time you look at a camera anyway. So it's just a question of matching it all up, which increasingly is what these supercomputers are being assigned to do. So now we're in the world of your digital twin and the manipulation of your digital twin. So in the West, I actually think there's a need to create a sovereign crypto that's wrapped in the rule of law, that is designed to protect the citizen, to have some inherent kind of bill of rights for our digital twins. But so far, the Americans are doing a test run through JP Morgan. Typical American, we privatize this, right? We're not going to have government launch it. We'll have a private entity try it first and see if it works. I think in Europe, they're not making much progress on this, although they've said, the EU has said, we want to have a sovereign crypto. So they're heading in that direction, but I think their concerns about personal privacy will prevent them from actually being able to develop it. I think Britain could be perfectly placed to introduce this kind of instrument, and the world would feel safe if it was wrapped in British rule of law. That's my personal view. So this is deep innovation I'm talking about, but it's occurring anyway. I just think some governments are figuring it out quicker than others.
I think that the most important thing is that if it can be something that is going to be embedded in rule of law and protecting the citizen, not making it basically a hostage to a particular government's impositions, then obviously it would be a success. I think that if not, the risk is that no matter what governments do, independent cryptocurrencies will go through the roof as an alternative. No, because it would generate a bigger action from citizens to run away from that type of surveillance, wouldn't it?
Well, and again, the private crypto is still going to be surveilling you, right?
Sure.
I mean, it's part of the more general, what they're calling surveillance capitalism, which is where all of your data, whether you throw it off via a mobile phone or, I mean, these days you have chips in your refrigerator and your rubbish bins that are capturing not only your voice, but what are you consuming? When do you throw it away? Do you use stuff past the sell-by date? Like, every time you look at a movie on a device, it's capturing your facial responses, your emotional responses. And so when you add it all up together, you get an incredibly comprehensive view of any particular individual. And I think this is the way to think about it. We have already entered a world where my digital twin exists. She knows more about me than I know about myself. And many governments and corporations already have access to all of her data and I don't. I
Yeah,
don't know even where is that? How do I find it? And this is a space that does not have a constitution. It does not have a legal framework, really. It's just only beginning to have any sense of what are the right ethics to have in that space. And yet we're all focused on the gathering data and not thinking about, okay, but who's using it for what reason?
absolutely, absolutely. I think it's absolutely fascinating. Sometimes terrifying, to be fairly honest, but it's certainly fascinating. We definitely don't know where we're going. I'm going to wrap up with just, I would like you, if you would be so kind as to share with our viewers right now, what would be the three top things that you think are worth paying attention as investors, as economists, as people who are looking at the world, in order to navigate, as you express in one of your books, this complex situation in which we are right now?
Yes. Well, the first thing I'd be on the hunt for are genuine unimpaired cash flows, things that actually make real money, not
Yeah,
maybe in the future, but they definitely make money right now. And
yeah,
those things may seem very boring, but they are, I think, going to be the secret to success. And they can be in many different things. There's no one country or sector. It's within any metric, what is actually making money. So that's number one. Number two is actually your own mindset. Because if we are in a quantum world where multiple realities are occurring simultaneously, and if I look around and I decide I think that the recovery from COVID is going to be like the Great Depression, we're going to be in a terrible situation for a decade, I'll be able to find the facts that will back that up. And
sure.
if I also come into it going, I think this is going to be the greatest period of industrial innovation since the Industrial Revolution, I will be able to find that too,
Yeah,
because they're both happening at the same time. So if you got a number two, watch your own mindset. What have you already decided is the
hmm,
outcome? Because that will define what you see and what you miss. And third, I would be really watching the innovators, but I don't mean just reading Wired magazine, much as I love Wired magazine. I mean also, like I said before, watching the artists, watching young people, basically watching how people create and take risks. Because everybody talks about Schumpeter's creative destruction, but they forget to mention that after you have the creative destruction, you have creative creation. And that's where we're going to be now, in creative creation. And so being open to that and looking for signs of it everywhere, I think is going to be a useful thing to do.
wow. Well, Pippa, I knew that this was going to be a great conversation. I could spend the whole day talking with you, but I'm not going to take more of your time. It's been absolutely fascinating and genuinely thought-provoking. A great conversation. It's always a great pleasure to talk with you. And I would recommend everyone that is watching to look at the description of the video, because there you'll have the books, the how to contact, and how to follow Dr. Pippa Malmgren, because she is one that you have to follow. Thank you so much, Pippa. It's a great pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
You're so kind. Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to my channel, like my videos, leave your comments below, and keep defending freedom. Thank you very much.